According to Amartya Sen, the true measure of human development is the capabilities that an individual has to choose a life that they have reason to value. Capabilities allow an individual to fully function in society. Capabilities are not income, and whilst obviously they include basic civil rights and political freedoms, capabilities are not limited to rights. In applying this framework to fiscal policy, we have to consider not only the relevance of fiscal sustainability to questions of intergenerational equity, but more broadly, we have to consider the impact on the well-being of individuals and society as a whole of every one of the expenditure and revenue decisions of government. That obviously is no small task. What about the size of government? The Whitlam government came to power with a broad-ranging policy agenda, the implementation of which had the effect of increasing both the scope and the size of Australian government. The agenda included real increases in social welfare payments. It included free university education, universal medical coverage, new departments of Aboriginal Affairs, of Environment, and Urban and Regional Development, and it included significant public sector real wage rises. The policy initiatives were reflected in strong growth in the level of government outlays over the course of the Whitlam government. Australian government expenditure grew from 18.9% of gross domestic product in 1971-72, that's the last full budget year before the Whitlam government came to power. It grew from 18.9% to 24.8% of GDP in 1975-76, that being the last budget delivered by the Whitlam government. That represents strong growth, obviously, of around 56% in real terms. In the 3.5 decades since, while there have been significant annual fluctuations, the average level of spending by the Australian government has changed little. Today, it's around 25.25% of gross domestic product. The Whitlam government was therefore responsible for an enduring increase in the size of government in Australia. That is, the close to 6 percentage points of gross domestic product expansion in government expenditure during the Whitlam government, it's never been reversed. And I think it's safe to say that it never will be. Initially, the increase in government expenditure wasn't matched by a commensurate increase in government revenue. Revenue increased by only 2 percentage points of gross domestic product over the term of the Whitlam government. But subsequent governments have chosen to fund the increased expenditure through increased taxation. That is, they have chosen to make larger government fiscally sustainable. What are the implications for well-being of these aggregate developments? Well, whatever the size of government, fiscal sustainability is important for maintaining macroeconomic stability. It's important for reducing aggregate economic vulnerabilities. And in those ways, it improves aggregate economic performance. It reduces the degree of uncertainty about future policy settings, and it facilitates growth-enhancing economic decision-making, especially regarding the accumulation of physical and human capital. Fiscal sustainability is likely, therefore, to be of positive value to aggregate measures of well-being, both now and in the future. The impact of the size of government per se on well-being is less clear. Based on the numerous efforts to estimate, at least for developed countries, to estimate an empirical relationship between the size of government and aggregate measures of things relevant to well-being, including rates of economic growth, it would be sensible to conclude, I'd suggest, that the optimal size of government is not a question that can be answered by a technical economic analysis. The question that is of key concern to the Treasury then goes beyond aggregates, to consider the impact on well-being of changes in the micro-level detail of government expenditure and revenue. I've noted that our well-being framework comprises 5 dimensions. It would be an exceptional case in which a policy intervention would be considered unambiguously positive across all 5 of those dimensions. And indeed, the wellbeing framework reflects our conviction that trade-offs matter deeply. And this emphasises the importance of assessing policy interventions in quite broad terms. An analysis of some of the key components of the increase in government expenditure since 1971-72 illustrates some of the trade-offs involved. Overall, in 1971-72, Australian government expenditure on health, education and social security and welfare was around 6% of GDP. That was 29% of total outlays. By 1975-76, expenditure on those items, that is health, education and social security and welfare, had doubled to be 12% of gross domestic product, or 45% of all government outlays. So the total increase in government expenditure under the Whitlam government is actually fully explained by an expansion of the social policy role of government in health, in education, in social security and welfare. And, as I've noted, the trend established by the Whitlam government has persisted. By 2008-09, the proportion of the Australian government's budget allocated to social security and welfare, health and education had grown from 45% to more than 60%. And by 2008-2009, it had increased from 12% of GDP in 75-76 to be 16.25% of gross domestic product. What do we have to show, pardon me, for these increases? Well, in attempting to answer that question, I'll focus separately on social security and welfare on the one hand and health expenditure on the other. Unlike education, in both of these areas, strong growth in outlays has continued post-Whitlam. In 1971-72, Australian government expenditure on social security and welfare was around 3.75% of GDP. By 75-76, this had risen to 6.25% of GDP. Since then, social security and welfare spending has continued to rise. Today, it's around 10.5% of GDP. Initially, an increase in the real level of welfare payment rates was an important factor in the rise. However, over time, welfare expenditure has been driven by an increase in the number of welfare recipients. In part, the increase in income support recipients reflects demographic factors that are effectively locked in. Obviously, as the population ages, there are more age pension recipients. Age pension outlays have increased from 1.5% of GDP in 71-72 to be around 2.5% of GDP in 2006-07. The most recent intergenerational report projected that age pension outlays would then increase by a further 1.9 percentage points of GDP over the 40 years out to 2046-47. Population ageing can also affect other income support payments. In particular, the level of disability support payments among older workers is significantly higher. But that's not the main factor behind the increase in welfare spending in recent decades. The proportion of income support recipients that are age pension recipients has actually fallen from around 75% of income support recipients in 71-72 to be around 50% of income support recipients today. Of course, social security and welfare payments can be affected by economic conditions as well as policy decisions. As unemployment rises, so do outlays on unemployment payments, obviously. The 1970s saw unemployment increase substantially, reflecting increased numbers out of work and people being out of work for longer durations. But the increase in the unemployment rate is not the main contributor to the increase in the number of income support recipients. Turns out the main contributors are sole parents and the disabled. And indeed, for many years now, there have been more people receiving disability support pensions than those receiving unemployment benefits. While much has been said and written on these matters, the fact is that we don't have a wholly satisfactory explanation for all of this growth in income support recipients. We have views, but not a wholly satisfactory explanation. Even so, it's understandable that economic and social policy analysts would be inquiring about the extent to which the tax and transfer system might be affecting people's decisions about the kind of life they lead. That people would be asking questions about whether the tax and transfer system is making it more or less likely that people are choosing a kind of life that they have reason to value.